Essays on the Science of Mythology, Part 2, The Psychology of the Child Archetype, by Carl Jung. Introduction. The author of the companion essay on the mythology of the child, or the child god, has asked me for a psychological commentary on the subject of his investigations. I am glad to accede to his request, although the undertaking seems to me no small venture in view of the great significance of the child motif in mythology. Kerényi himself has enlarged upon this occurrence of this motif in Greece and Rome, where parallels drawn from Indian, Finnish, and other sources, thus indicating the presentation of the theme would allow of yet further extensions. Though a comprehensive description would contribute nothing decisive in principle, it would nevertheless produce an overwhelming impression of the worldwide incidence and frequency of the motif. The customary treatment of mythological motifs so far in separate departments of science, such as philology, ethnology, the history of civilization, and comparative religion, was not exactly a help to us in recognizing their universality, and the psychological problems raised by this universality could easily be shelved by hypothesis of migration. Consequently, Adolf Bastion's ideas met with little success in their day. Even then, there was sufficient empirical material available to permit far-reaching psychological conclusions, but the necessary premises were lacking. Although the psychological knowledge of that time included myth formation in its province, witness Wundt's Wunderpsychology, it was not in a position to demonstrate the same process as a living function actually present in the psyche of civilized man, any more than it could understand mythological motifs as structural elements of the psyche. True to its history, when psychology was metaphysics first of all, then the study of the senses and their function, and then of the conscious mind and its functions, psychology identified its proper subject as with the conscious psyche and its contents, and thus completely overlooked the existence of non-conscious psyche. Although various philosophers, among them Leibniz, Kant, and Schelling, had already pointed very clearly to the problem of the dark side of the psyche, it was a physician who felt impelled from his scientific and medical experience to point to the unconscious as the essential basis of the psyche. This was C.G. Carnus, the authority whom Edward von Hartmann followed. In recent times it was, once again, medical psychology that approached the problem of the unconscious without philosophical preconceptions. It became clear from many separate investigations that the psychopathology of the neurosis and of many psychoses cannot dispense with the hypothesis of a dark side of the psyche, i.e., the unconscious. It is the same with the psychology of dreams, which is really the terra intermedia between normal and pathological psychology. In the dreams, as in the products of psychosis, there are numberless interconnections to which one can find parallels only in mythological association of ideas, or perhaps in certain poetic creations in which are often characterized by a borrowing, and not always conscious, from myths. Had thorough investigation shown that in the majority of such cases it was simply a matter of forgotten knowledge, the physician would not have gone to the trouble of making extensive researches into individual and collective parallels. But, in point of fact, typical mythologems were observed among the individuals to whom all knowledge of this kind was absolutely out of the question, and where indirect derivation from religious ideas might have been known to them, or from popular figures of speech, was impossible. Such conclusions forced us to assume that we must be dealing with autochthonous revivals independent of all tradition, and consequently that myth-forming structural elements must be present in the unconscious psyche. These products are never, or at very least seldom, myths with a definite term, but rather mythological components which, because of their typical nature, we call motifs, primordial images, types, or, as I have named them, archetypes. The child archetype is an excellent example. Today we can hazard the formula that the archetypes appear in myths and fairy tales just as they do in dreams and in the products of psychotic fantasy. The medium in which they are embedded is, in the former case, an ordered and for the most part immediately understandable context, but in the latter case a generally unintelligible, irrational, not to say delirious sequence of images, which nonetheless does not lack a certain hidden coherence. In the individual, the archetypes appear as involuntary manifestations of unconscious process, whose existence and meaning can only be inferred, whereas the myths deal with traditional forms of incalculable age. They harken back to a prehistoric world where spiritual preconceptions and general conditions we can still observe today among existing primitives. Myths on this level are as a rule tribal history handed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. Primitive mentality differs from the civilized chiefly in that the conscious mind is far less developed in scope and intensity. Functions such as thinking, willing, etc. are not yet differentiated, yet they are preconscious, and in the case of a thinking, for instance, this shows itself in the circumstances that the primitive does not think consciously, but that thoughts appear. The primitive cannot assert that he thinks, but it is rather that something thinks in him. The spontaneity of the act of thinking does not lie causally in his conscious mind, but in his unconscious. Moreover, she is incapable of any conscious effort of will. She must put herself beforehand into the mode of willing, or let herself be put, hence her rite d'entrée et de sortie. Her consciousness is menaced by an almighty unconscious, hence her fear of magical influences which may cross her path at any moment. And for this reason, too, she is surrounded by unknown forces that must adjust herself to them as best she can. Owing to the chronic twilight state of her unconscious, it is often next to impossible to find out whether he merely dreamed something or whether he really experienced it. The spontaneous manifestation of the unconscious and its archetypes intrudes everywhere into his conscious mind, but the mythological world of his ancestors, for instance, the Alkara or Bulgari of the Australian Aborigines, is a reality equal, if not superior, to the material world. It is not the world as we know it that speaks out of his unconscious, but the unknown world of the psyche, for which we know that it mirrors our empirical world only in part, and that, for the other part, it molds this empirical world in accordance with its own psychic assumptions. The archetype does not proceed from physical facts, but describes how the psyche experiences the physical fact, and in doing so, the psyche often behaves so autocratically that it denies tangible reality or makes statements that fly in the face of it. The primitive mentality does not invent myths, it experiences them. Myths are original revelations of the preconscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings, and anything but allegories of physical processes. Such allegories would be an idle amusement for an unscientific intellect. Myths, on the contrary, have a vital meaning. Not merely do they represent, they are the psychic life of the primitive tribe, which immediately falls to pieces and decays when it loses its mythological heritage, like a man who has lost his soul. A tribe's mythology is its living religion, whose loss is always and everywhere, even among the civilized, a moral catastrophe. But religion is a vital link with psychic processes independent of and beyond consciousness, in the dark hinterland of the psyche. Many of these unconscious processes may be indirectly occasioned by consciousness, but never by conscious choice. Others appear to arise spontaneously, that is to say, from no discernible or demonstrable conscious cause. Modern psychology treats the products of unconscious fantasy activity as self-portraits of what is going on in the unconscious, or as statements of the unconscious psyche about itself. They fall into two categories. First, fantasies, including dreams, of a personal character, which go back unquestionably to personal experience, things forgotten or repressed, and can thus be completely explained by individual anamnesis. Second, fantasies, including dreams, of an impersonal character, which cannot be reduced to experiences in the individual's past, and thus cannot be explained as something individually acquired. These fantasy images undoubtedly have their closest analogies in mythological types. We must therefore assume that they correspond to certain collective and not personal structural elements of the human psyche in general, and, like the morphological elements of the human body, are inherited. Although traditional and transmission by migration certainly play a part, there are, as we have said, very many cases that cannot be accounted for in this way and drive us to the hypothesis of an autochthonous revival. These cases are so numerous that we are obliged to assume the existence of a collective psychic substratum. I called this the collective unconscious. The products of the second category resemble the type of structures to be met within myth and fairy tale so much that we must regard them as related. It is therefore wholly within the realm of possibility that both the mythological types as well as the individual types arise under quite similar conditions. As already mentioned, the fantasy products of the second category, as those with the first, arise in a state of reduced intensity of consciousness, in dreams, delirium, reveries, or visions, etc. In all these states, the check put upon unconscious contents by the concentration of the conscious mind ceases, so that the hitherto unconscious material streams as though from open side sluices into the field of consciousness. This mode of origination is the general rule. Reduced intensity of consciousness in the absence of concentration and intention, Janet's abaissement de niveau mental, correspond pretty exactly to the primitive state of consciousness in which we must suppose myths were originally formed. It is therefore exceedingly probable that the mythological archetypes too made their appearance in much the same manner as the manifestations of archetypal structures among individuals today. The methodological principle in accordance with which psychology treats the products of the unconscious is this: contents of an archetypical character are manifestations of processes in the collective unconscious. Here, they do not refer to anything that is or has been conscious, but to something essentially unconscious. In the last analysis, therefore, it is impossible to say what they refer to. Every interpretation necessarily remains an as-if. The ultimate core of meaning may be circumscribed, but not described. Even so, the bare circumscription denotes an essential step forward in our knowledge of the preconscious structure of the psyche, which was already in existence when there was as yet no unity of personality. Even today, the primitive is not securely possessed of it, and no consciousness at all. We can also observe this preconscious state in early childhood, and as a matter of fact, it is the dreams of this early period that not infrequently bring extremely remarkable archetypal contents to light. If, then, we proceed in accordance with the above principle, there is no longer any question whether a myth refers to the sun or the moon, the father or the mother, sexuality or fire or water. All it does is to circumscribe and give an approximate description of the unconscious core of meaning. The ultimate meaning of this nucleus was never conscious and never will be. It was and still is only interpreted, and every interpretation that comes anywhere near the hidden sense, or, for that point of view of scientific intellect, nonsense, which comes to the same thing, has always, right from the beginning, laid claim not only to absolute truth and validity, but to instant reverence and religious devotion. Archetypes were, and still are, living psychic forces that demand to be taken seriously, and they have a strange way of making sure of their effect. Always they were bringers of protection and salvation, and their violation has its consequences, the perils of the soul known to us from the psychology of primitives. Moreover, they are the unfailing causes of neurotic and even psychotic disorders, behaving exactly like neglected or maltreated physical organs or organic functional systems. An archetypical content expresses itself first and foremost in metaphors. If such a content should speak of the sun, and identify with it the lion, the king, the hoard of gold guarded by the dragon, the power that makes for life and the health of man, it is neither the one thing nor the other, but the unknown third thing that finds more or less adequate expression in all of these similes, yet, to the perpetual vexation of the intellect, remains unknown and not to be fitted into a formula. For this reason, the scientific intellect is always inclined to put on airs of enlightenment in the hope of banishing the spectre once and for all. Whether its encounters were euphorism or Christian apologetics, or the Enlightenment in the narrow sense, or positivism, there was always a myth hiding behind it in new and disconcerting garb, which then, following the ancient and venerable pattern, gave itself out as ultimate truth. In reality, we can never legitimately cut loose from our archetypical foundation unless we are prepared to pay the price of a neurosis, any more than we can rid ourselves of our body and its organs without committing suicide. If we cannot deny the archetypes or otherwise neutralize them, we are confronted at every new stage in the differentiation of consciousness to which civilization attains, with the task of finding a new interpretation appropriate to this stage, in order to connect the life of the past that still exists in us with the life of the present, which threatens to slip away from it. If this link-up does not take place, a kind of rootless consciousness comes into being no longer oriented to the past, a consciousness which succumbs helplessly to all manner of suggestion and, in practice, is susceptible to psychic epidemics. With the loss of the past, now become insignificant, devalued, and incapable of revaluation, the Savior too is lost, for the Savior is either the insignificant thing itself, or else arises out of it. Over and over again in the metamorphosis of the gods, he rises up as a prophet or firstborn of a new generation, and appears unexpectedly in the unlikeliest of places, sprung from a stone, tree, furrow, water, etc., and in ambiguous form, Tom Thumb, a dwarf, a child, an animal, and so on. This archetype of the child god is extremely widespread and intimately bound up with all other mythological aspects of the child motif. It is hardly necessary to allude to the still-living Christ child, who, in the legend of St. Christopher, also has the typical features of being smaller than small and bigger than big. In folklore, the child motif appears in the guise of the dwarf or the elf, as personifications of the hidden force of nature. In this sphere also brings the little metal man of late antiquity, Anthroporion, who, till far into the Middle Ages, on the one hand inhabited the mine shafts, and on the other represented the alchemical metals. Above all, Mercurius reborn, in perfect form, as a hermaphrodite, Filius Septiae, or Infans Noster. Thanks to the religious interpretation of the child, a fair amount of evidence has come down to us from the Middle Ages, showing that the child was not merely a traditional figure, but a vision spontaneously experienced as a so-called eruption of the unconscious. I would mention Meister Eckhart's version of the naked boy in the dream of brother Eustathius. Interesting accounts of these spontaneous experiences are also to be found in the English ghost stories, where we read of the vision of a radiant boy said to have been seen in a place where there are Roman remains. This apparition was supposed to be of evil omen. It almost looks as though we were dealing with a figure of a puer aeternus, who had become inauspicious through metamorphosis, or, in other words, had shared the fate of the classical and Germanic gods, who had all become bugbears. The mystical character of the experience is also confirmed in Part 2 of Ghost Faust, where Faust himself is transformed into a boy and admitted into the choir of blessed youths, this being the larval stage of Dr. Marianus. In the strange tale called Das Reich Raun by Bruno Gotz, a puer aeternus named Fo, which equals Buddha, appears with a whole troop of unholy boys of evil significance. Contemporary parallels are better left alone. I mention this instance only to demonstrate the enduring vitality of the child archetype. The child motif not infrequently occurs in the field of psychopathology. The imaginary child is common among women with mental disorders and is usually interpreted in a Christian sense. Homunculi also appear, as in the famous Schreber case, where they come in swarms and plagues the sufferer. But the clearest and most significant manifestation of the child motif in the therapy of neurosis is the maturation process of personality induced by the analysis of the unconscious, which I term the process of individuation. Here we are confronted with a pre-conscious process which, in the form of more or less well-formed fantasies, gradually pass over into the unconscious, into the conscious mind, or become conscious of dreams, or lastly are made conscious through the methods of active imagination. This material is rich in archetypal motifs, among them frequently that of the child. Often child is formed after the Christian model, more often, though, it develops from earlier, altogether non-Christian levels, that is to say, out of chthonic animals such as crocodiles, dragons, serpents, or monkeys. Sometimes the child appears in the cup of a flower, or out of a golden egg, or at the center of a mandala. In dreams it often appears as the dreamer's son or daughter, or as a boy, a youth, or a girl. Occasionally it seems to be of exotic origin, Indian or Chinese with dusky skin, or appearing more cosmically, surrounded by stars, or with a starry coronet, or as the king's son or the witch's child with daimonic attributes. Seen as a special instance of the treasure hard to attain motif, the child motif is extremely variable, and assumes all manner of shapes such as the jewel, the pearl, the flower, the chalice, the golden egg, the quartanity, the golden ball, and so on. It can be interchanged with these and similar images almost without limit. 2. The psychology of the child archetype. 1. The archetype as a link with the past. As to the psychology of our theme, I must point out that every statement going beyond the purely phenomenal aspect of the archetype lays itself open to the criticism we have expressed above. Not for a moment dare we succumb to the illusion that an archetype can be finally explained and disposed of. Even the best attempts at explaining are only more or less successful translations into another metaphorical language. Indeed, language itself is only an image. The most we can do is dream the myth onwards and give it a modern dress. And whatever explanation or interpretation does to it, we do to our own souls as well, with corresponding results for our own well-being. The archetype, let us never forget this, is a psychic organ present in all of us. A bad explanation means a correspondingly bad attitude to this organ, which may thus be injured. But the ultimate sufferer is the bad interpreter himself. Hence the explanation should always be such that the functional significance of the archetype remain unimpaired, so that an adequate and meaningful connection between the conscious mind and the archetype is assured. For the archetype is an element of our psychic structure and thus a vital and necessary component in our psychic economy. It represents or personifies certain instinctive data of the dark, primitive psyche, the real but invisible roots of consciousness. Of what elementary importance the connection with the roots is, we see from the preoccupation of the primitive mentality with certain magic factors, which are nothing less than what we would call archetypes. This original form of religio, linking back, is the essence, the working basis of all religious life even today, and always will be, whatever future form this life may take. There is no rational substitute for the archetype any more than there is the cerebellum for the cerebellum or the kidneys. We can examine the physical organs anatomically, histologically, and embryologically. This would correspond to an outline of archetypal phenomenology and its presentation in terms of comparative history. But we only arrive at the meaning of a physical organ when we begin to ask teleological questions. Hence the query arises, what is the biological purpose of the archetype? Just as physiological answers such a question for the body, so it is the business of psychology to answer it for the archetype. Statements like, the child motif is a vestigial memory of one's own childhood, and similar explanations merely beg the question. But if, giving this proposition a slight twist, we were to say the child motif is a picture of a certain forgotten things in our childhood, we are getting closer to the truth. Since, however, the archetype is always an image belonging to the whole human race, and not merely to the individual, we might put it better this way. The child motif represents the preconscious childhood aspect of the collective psyche. We shall not go wrong if we take this statement for the time being historically on the analogy of a certain psychological experiences which show that certain phases in an individual's life can be autonomous, can personify themselves to the extent that they result in a vision of oneself. For example, one sees oneself as a child. Visionary experiences of this kind, whether they occur in dreams or in the waking state, are, as we know, conditional on a disassociation having previously taken place between past and present. Such disassociations come about because of various incompatibilities. For instance, a man's present state may have come into conflict with his childhood state, or he may have violently sundered himself from his original character in the interest of some arbitrary persona more in keeping with his ambitions. He has thus become unchildlike and artificial and has lost his roots. All this presents a favorable opportunity for an equally vehement confrontation with a primary truth. In view of the fact that men have not yet ceased to make statements about the child God, we may perhaps extend the individual analogy to the life of mankind, and say in conclusion that humanity too, probably also, comes into conflict with its childhood conditions. That is, with its original unconscious and instinctive state, and that the danger of this kind of conflict, which induces the vision of a child, actually exists. Religious observations, the retelling and ritual repetition of the mythical event, religious observances, i.e., the retelling and ritual repetition of the mythical event, consequently serve the purpose of bringing the image of childhood and everything connected with it again and again before the eyes of the conscious mind so that the link with the original condition may not be broken. 2. The function of the archetype. The child motif represents not only something that existed in the distant past, but also something that exists now. That is to say, it is not just a vestige of a system functioning in the present whose purpose is to compensate or correct, in a meaningful manner, the inevitable one-sidedness and extravagances of the conscious mind. It is in the nature of the conscious mind to concentrate on relatively few contents and to raise them to the highest pitch of clarity. A necessary result and precondition is the exclusion of other potential contents of the consciousness. The exclusion is bound to bring about a certain one-sidedness of the conscious content. Since the differentiated consciousness of civilized man has been granted an effective instrument for the practical realization of its contents through the dynamics of her will, there is all the more danger, the more she trains her will, of her getting lost in one-sidedness and the deviating further and further from the laws and roots of her being. This means, on the one hand, the possibility of human freedom, on the other, it is a source of endless transgressions against one's instincts. Accordingly, primitive people, being closer to her instincts, like the animal, is characterized by fear of novelty and adherence to tradition. To our way of thinking, she is painfully backward, whereas we exalt progress. But our progressiveness, though it may result in a great many delightful wish fulfillments, piles up an equally gigantic Promethean debt, which has to be paid off from time to time in the form of hideous catastrophes. For ages, man has dreamed of flying, and all he got for it is saturation bombings. We smile today at the Christian hope of a life beyond the grave, and yet we often fall into Eleusinians 100 times more ridiculous than the notion of a happy hereafter. Our differentiated consciousness is in continual danger of being uprooted. Hence it needs compensation through the still existing state of childhood. The symptoms of compensation are described, from the progressive point of view, in scarcely flattering terms, since to the superficial eye it looks like a retarding operation. People speak of inertia, backwardness, skepticism, fault-finding, conservatism, timidity, pettiness, and so on. But inasmuch as people have, in high degree, the capacity for cutting themselves off from their own roots, they may be swept uncritically to catastrophe by their dangerous one-sidedness. The retarding idea is always more primitive, more natural in a good sense as in the bad, and more moral, in that it keeps faith with laws and tradition. The progressive ideal is always more abstract, more unnatural, and less moral, in that it demands disloyalty to tradition. Progressive, enforced by will, is always convulsive. Backwardness may be closer to naturalness, but in its turn it always is menaced by painful awakenings. The older view of things realized that progress is only possible, Dio conscendenti, thus proving itself conscious of the opposites and repeating the age-old rite d'entrée et de sortie on a higher plane. The more differentiated consciousness becomes, the greater the degree of severance from the root condition. Complete severance comes when the Dio conscendenti is forgotten. Now it is an axiom of psychology that when a part of the psyche is split off of consciousness, it is only apparently inactivated. In actual fact, it brings about a possession of the personality, with the result that the individual's aims are falsified in the interest of the split-off part. If then the childhood state of the collective psyche is repressed to the point of total exclusion, the unconscious content overwhelms the conscious aim and inhibits, falsifies, and even destroys its realization. Viable progress only comes from the cooperation of both. The futurity of the archetype. One of the essential features of the child motif is its futurity. The child is potential future. Hence the occurrence of the child motif in the psychology of the individual signifies as a rule an anticipation of future developments, even though at first sight it may seem like retrospective configuration. Life is a flux, a flowing into the future, and not a stoppage or a backwash. It is therefore not surprising that so many of the mythological saviors are child gods. This agrees exactly with our experience of the psychology of the individual, which shows that the child paves the way for a future change of personality. In the individuation process, it anticipates the figure that comes from the synthesis of conscious and unconscious elements in the personality. It is therefore a symbol which unites the opposites. A mediator, bringer of healing, that is, who makes whole. Because it has this meaning, the child motif is capable of the numerous transformations mentioned above. It can be expressed by roundness, the circle or sphere, or else by the quartinity as another form of wholeness. I have called this wholeness that transcends consciousness the self. The goal of the individuation process is the synthesis of the self. From another point of view, the term entelechy might be preferable to synthesis. This is an empirical reason why entelechy is, in certain conditions, more fitting. The symbols of wholeness frequently occur at the beginning of the individuation process. Indeed, they can often be observed in the first dreams of early infancy. This observation says much for the a priori existence of potential wholeness, and on this account the idea of entelechy instantly recommends itself. But in so far as the individuation process occurs, empirically speaking, as a synthesis, it looks, paradoxically enough, as if something already existent were being put together. From this point of view, the term synthesis is also applicable. 4. Unity and plurality of the child motif. In the manifold phenomenology of the child, we have to distinguish between the unity and the plurality of its respective manifestations. Where, for instance, numerous homunculi, dwarves, boys, etc. appear, having no individual characteristics at all, there is the probability of a dissociation. Such forms are therefore found especially in schizophrenia, which is essentially a fragmentation of personality. The many children then represent the products of its dissolution. But if the plurality occurs in normal people, then it is the representation of an as yet incomplete synthesis of personality. The personality, viz. The self, is still the plural stage, i.e. an ego may be present, but it cannot experience its wholeness within the framework of its own personality, only within the community of the family, tribe, or nation. It is still in the stage of unconscious identification with the plurality of the group. The Church takes due account of this widespread condition in her doctrine on the corpus mysticum, of which the individual is by nature a member. If, however, the child motif appears in the form of a unity, we are dealing with an unconscious and provisionally complete synthesis of the personality, which in practice, like everything unconscious, signifies no more than a possibility. 5. Child God and Child Hero. Sometimes the child looks more like a child god, sometimes more like a young hero. Common to both types is the miraculous birth and the adversities of early childhood, abandonment and the danger through persecution. The god is by nature wholly supernatural. The hero's nature is human, but raised to the limit of the supernatural. She is semi-divine. While the god, especially in her close affinity with the symbolic animal, personifies the collective unconscious, which is not yet integrated into a human being, the hero's supernaturalness includes human nature and thus represents a synthesis of the divine, i.e., not yet humanized, unconscious and human consciousness. Consequently, she signifies the potential anticipation of an individuation process which is approaching wholeness. For this reason, the various child fates may be regarded as illustrating the kind of psychic events that occur in the entelechy, or genesis of the self. The miraculous birth tries to depict the way in which this genius is experienced. Since it is a psychic genius, everything must happen non-empirically, e.g. by means of a virgin birth, or by miraculous conception, or by birth from unnatural organs. The motifs of insignificance, exposure, abandonment, danger, etc., try to show how precarious is the psychic possibility of wholeness, that is, the enormous difficulties to be met with in attaining this highest good. They also signify the powerlessness and helplessness of the life urges, which subjects every growing thing to the law of maximum self-fulfillment, while at the same time the environmental influences place all sorts of insuperable obstacles in the way of individuation. More especially, the threat to one's inmost self from dragons and serpents points to the danger of the newly acquired consciousness being swallowed up again by the instinctive psyche, the unconscious. The lower vertebrates have from earliest time been favorite symbols of the collective psychic substratum, which is localized anatomically in the subcortical centers, the cerebellum and the spinal cord. These organs constitute the snake. Snake dreams usually occur, therefore, when the conscious mind is deviating from its instinctual basis. The motif of smaller, yet small, and bigger, yet bigger than big, complements the impotence of the child by means of its equally miraculous deeds. This paradox is the essence of the hero and runs through her whole destiny like a red thread. She can cope with the greatest perils, yet in the end something quite insignificant is her undoing. Balder perishes because of the mistletoe, Maui because of the laughter of a little bird, Siegfried because of his one vulnerable spot, Hercules because of his wife's gift, others because of some common treachery, and so on. The hero's main feat is to overcome the monster darkness. It is the long hoped for and expected triumph of consciousness over the unconscious. Day and light are synonyms for consciousness, night and dark for the unconscious. The coming of consciousness was probably the most tremendous experience of primeval times, for with it a world came into being whose existence no one had suspected before. And God said, "Let there be light," is the projection of the immemorable experience of the separation of the conscious from the unconscious. Even among primitives today, the possession of a soul is a precarious thing, and the loss of soul is a typical psychic malady which drives the primitive medicine to all sorts of psychotherapeutic measures. Hence, the child distinguishes itself by deeds which point to the conquest of the dark. 3. The special phenomenology of the child archetype. 1. The abandonment of the child. Abandonment, exposure, danger, etc. are all elaborations of a child's insignificant beginnings and of its mysterious and miraculous birth. This statement describes a certain psychic experience of a creative nature, whose object is the emergence of a new and as yet unknown content. It is the psychology of the individual. In the psychology of the individual, there is always, at such moments, an agonizing situation of conflict from which there seems to be no way out, at least for the conscious mind, since, as far as this is concerned, tertium non datur. But out of this collision of opposites, the unconscious psyche always creates a third thing of an irrational nature, which the conscious mind neither expects nor understands. It presents itself in the form that is neither a straight yes nor a straight no, and is consequently rejected by both. For the conscious mind knows nothing beyond the opposites, and as a result has no knowledge of the thing that unites them. Since, however, the solution of the conflict through the union of opposites is of vital importance, and is moreover the very thing that the conscious mind is longing for, some inkling of the creative act and of the significance of it nevertheless gets through. From this comes the numinous character of the child. A meaningful but unknown content always has a secret fascination for the conscious mind. The new configuration is a nascent whole. It is on the way to wholeness, at least in so far as it excels in wholeness, the conscious mind, when torn by opposites, and surpasses it in its completeness. For this reason, all uniting symbols have a redemptive significance. Out of this situation, the child emerges as a symbolic content, manifestly separate or even isolated from its background, the mother, but sometimes including the mother in its perilous situation, threatened on the one hand by the negative attitude of the conscious mind, and on the other by the horror vacui of the unconscious, which is quite ready to swallow up all of its progeny, since it produces them only in play, and destruction is an inescapable part of its play. Nothing in all the world welcomes this new birth, although it is the most precious fruit of Mother Nature herself, the most pregnant with the future, signifying a higher stage of self-realization. This is why nature, the world of the instincts, takes the child under its wing. It is nourished or protected by animals. Child means something evolving towards independence. That is, it cannot do without detaching itself from its origins. Abandonment is therefore a necessary condition, not just a concomitant symptom. The conflict is not to be overcome by the conscious mind remaining caught between the opposites, and for this very reason it needs a symbol to point out the necessity of detaching itself from its origins. Because the symbol of the child fascinates and grips the conscious minds, its redemptive effect passes over into consciousness and brings about the separation from the conflict situation which the conscious mind, by itself, was unable to achieve. The symbol anticipates a nascent state of consciousness. So long as this is not actually in being, the child remains a mythological projection, which requires religious repetition and renewal by ritual. The Christ child, for instance, is a religious necessity only so long as the majority of people are incapable of giving psychological reality to the saying, "Except ye become as little children." Since all such developments and transitions are extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, it is no wonder that figures of this kind persist for hundreds or even thousands of years. Everything that people should and yet cannot be or do, be it a positive or negative sense, lives on as a mythological figure and anticipation alongside one's consciousness, either as a religious projection or, what is still more dangerous, an unconscious content, which then project themselves spontaneously into incongruous objects, i.e. hygienic and other Venistic doctrines or practices. All these are so many rationalized substitutes for mythology, and their unnaturalness does more harm than good. The conflict situation that offers no way out, the sort of situation that produces the child as an irrational third, is of course a formula appropriate only to the psychological, that is, modern stage of development. It is not strictly applicable to the psychic life of primitives, if only because primitive people's childlike range of consciousness still excludes a whole world of possible psychic experiences. Since on the nature level of the primitive, our modern moral conflict is still an objective calamity that threatens life itself. Hence not a few child figures are cultural heroes and thus identified with things that promote culture, for example, fire, metal, corn, maize, etc. As bringers of light, that is, enlargers of consciousness, they overcome darkness, which is to say, they overcome the earlier unconscious state. Higher consciousness, or knowledge going beyond our present-day consciousness, is equivalent to being all alone in the world. This loneliness expresses the conflict between the bearer or symbol of higher consciousness and his or her surroundings. The conqueror of darkness goes far back into primitive times, and together with many other legends, proves that one existed in a state of original psychic distress, namely unconsciousness. Hence, in all probability, the irrational fear which primitive people has of the dark even today. I found a form of religion among a tribe living on Mount Elgon that corresponded to pantheistic optimism. Their optimistic mood was, however, always in abeyance between 6 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning, during which time it was replaced by fear, for in the night the dark being Ayik had his dominion, the maker of fear. During the daytime there was no monster snakes anywhere in the vicinity, but at night they were lurking on every path. At night the whole of mythology was let loose. The invincibility of the child, too. It is a striking paradox in all child myths that the child is on the one hand delivered helpless into the power of terrible enemies and in continual danger of extinction, while on the other he possesses powers far exceeding those of ordinary humanity. This is closely related to the psychological fact that though the child may be insignificant, unknown, or a mere child, she is also divine. From the conscious standpoint, we seem to be dealing with an insignificant content that has no releasing, let alone redeeming character. The conscious mind is caught in its conflict situation, and the combatant forces seem so overwhelming that the child, as an isolated content, bears no relation to the conscious factors. It is therefore easily overlooked and falls back into the unconscious. At least this is what we should have to fear if things turned out according to our conscious expectations. Myth, however, emphasizes that this is not so, but that the child is endowed with superpowers and, despite all dangers, will unexpectedly pull through. The child is born out of the womb of the unconscious, begotten out of the depths of nature, or rather out of living nature herself. It is a personification of vital forces quite outside the limited range of our conscious mind, by ways of possibilities of which our one-sided conscious mind knows nothing. A wholeness which embraces the very depths of nature. It represents the strongest, the most ineluctable urge in every being, namely the urge to realize itself. It is, as it were, the incarnation of the inability to do otherwise, equipped with all the powers of nature and instincts, whereas the conscious mind is always getting caught up in the supposed ability to do otherwise. The urge and compulsion to self-realization is a law of nature, and thus of invincible power, even though its effect, at the start, is insignificant and improbable. Its power is revealed in the miraculous deeds of the child hero, and later in the alpha works of the bondsman or thrall of the Heracles type, where, although the hero has outgrown the impotence of the child, she is still in a menial position. The figure of the thrall generally leads up to the real epiphany of the semi-divine hero. Oddly enough, we have a similar modulation of themes in alchemy, in the synonyms for the lapis, as in the materia prima. It is the lapis exilis and vilis. As a substance in process of transmutation, it is cervis rubeus or fugitivus, and finally, in its true apotheosis, it attains the dignity of filius sapientitae or deus terrenus, a light above all lights, a power that contains in itself all the powers of the upper and nether regions. It becomes a corpus glorificatium, which enjoys everlasting incorruptibility and is therefore a panacea, a bringer of healing. The size and the invincibility of the child are bound up in Hindu speculation with the nature of the Atman, which corresponds to the smaller than small, yet bigger than big motif. As an individual phenomenon, the self is smaller than small. As the equivalent of the cosmos, it is bigger than big. The self, regarded as the counterpole of the world, is its absolute other, is the sine qua non of all empirical knowledge and consciousness of subject and object. Only because of the psychic otherness is consciousness possible at all. Identity does not make consciousness possible. It is only separation, detachment, and agonizing confrontation through opposition that produces consciousness and insight. Hindu introspection recognized this psychological fact very early, and consequently equated the subject of cognition with the subject of ontology in general. In accordance with the predominantly introverted attitude of Indian thinking, the object lost the attribute of absolute reality and, in some systems, became a mere illusion. The Greek Occidental type of mind could not free itself from the conviction of the world's absolute existence, at the cost, however, of the cosmic significance of the self. Even today, Western people find it hard to see the psychological necessity for a transcendental subject of cognition as the counterpole of the empirical universe, although the postulate of a world confronting self, or at least as a point of reflection, is a logical necessity. Regardless of philosophy's perpetual attitude of dissent or only half-hearted assent, there is always a compensating tendency in our unconscious psyche to produce the symbol of the self in its cosmic significance. These efforts take on the archetypal forms of the hero myth, such as can be observed in almost any individuation process. The phenomenology of the childbirth always points back to the original psychological state of non-recognition, i.e., of darkness or twilight of non-differentiation between subject and object, of unconscious identity of people and the universe. This phase of non-differentiation produces the golden egg, which is both people and universe, and yet neither, but an irrational third. To the twilight consciousness of primitive people, it seems as if the egg came out of the womb of the wide world and were, accordingly, a cosmic, objective, external occurrence. To a differentiated consciousness, on the other hand, it seems evident that this egg is nothing but a symbol thrown up by the psyche, or, were it even worse, a fanciful speculation, and therefore nothing but a primitive phantasm, of which no reality of any kind attaches. Present-day medical psychology, however, thinks somewhat differently about these phantasms. It knows only too well that dire disturbances of the bodily functions and what devastating psychic consequences can flow from mere fantasies. Fantasies are the natural expression of the life of the unconscious. But since the unconscious is the psyche of all the body's autonomous functional complexes, its fantasies have an etiological significance that is not to be despised. From the psychopathology of the individuation process, we know that the formation of symbols is frequently associated with physical disorders of a psychic origin, which in some cases are felt as decidedly real. In medicine, fantasies are real things that, with the psychotherapist, has to reckon very seriously indeed. She cannot therefore deprive all the justification for those primitive phantasms whose content is so real that it is projected onto the external world. In the last analysis, the human body too is built of the stuff of the world, the very stuff wherein fantasies become visible. Indeed, without it they could not be experienced at all. Without this stuff they would be like a sort of abstract crystalline lattice in a solution where the crystallization process had not yet started. The symbol of the self arises in the depths of the body, and they express its maturity every bit as much as the structure of the perceiving consciousness. The symbol is thus a living body, corpus et anima, hence the child is such an apt formula for the symbol. The uniqueness of the psyche can never enter wholly into reality. It can only be realized approximately, though it still remains the absolute basis of all consciousness. The deeper layers of the psyche lose their individual uniqueness as they retreat further and further into darkness. Lower down, that is to say, as they approach the autonomous functional systems, they become increasingly collective until they are universalized and extinguished in the body's materiality, i.e., chemical substances. The body's carbon is simply carbon. Hence at bottom the psyche is simply world. In this sense I hold Kerényi to be absolutely right when he says that in the symbol the world itself is speaking. The more archaic and deeper that is, the more psychological the symbol is, the more collective and universal, the more material it is. The more abstract, differentiated, and specific it is, the more its natural approximations to conscious uniqueness and individuality, the more it sloughs off its universal character. Having finally attained full consciousness, it runs the risk of becoming a mere allegory, which nowhere oversteps the bounds of conscious comprehension, and is then exposed to all sorts of attempts at rationalistic and therefore inadequate explanation. 3. Hermaphroditism of the child. It is a remarkable fact that perhaps the majority of cosmogonic gods are of a bisexual nature. The hermaphrodite means nothing less than a union of the strongest and most striking opposites. In the first place, this union refers back to the primitive state of mind, a twilight where differences and contrasts were either barely separated or completely merged. With increasing clarity of consciousness, however, the opposites draw more and more distinctly and irreconcilably apart. If, therefore, the hermaphrodite were only a product of primitive and non-differentiation, we would have to expect that it would soon be eliminated with increasing civilization. This is by no means the case. On the contrary, people's imagination has been preoccupied with this idea over and over again on the high and even the highest levels of culture, as we have seen from the late Greek and syncretic philosophy of Gnosticism. The hermaphroditic rebus has an important part to play in the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages, and in our own day we hear of Christ's androgyny in Catholic mysticism. We can no longer be dealing with, then, the continued existence of a primitive phantasm, or with an original contamination of opposites. Rather, we can see from medieval writings the primordial idea has come as a symbol of the creative union of opposites, a uniting symbol in the literal sense. In its functional significance, the symbol no longer points back, but forward to a goal not yet reached. Notwithstanding its monstrosity, the hermaphrodite has generally turned into a subduer of conflicts and a bringer of healing, and acquired this meaning in relatively early phases of civilization. This vital meaning explains why the image of the hermaphrodite did not fade out in primitive times, but on the contrary was able to assert itself with increasing profundity of symbolic content for thousands of years. The fact that an idea so utterly archaic could rise to such exalted heights of means not only points to the vitality of the archetypal ideals, it also demonstrates the rightness of the principle of the archetype, because of its power to unite opposites, mediates between the unconscious substratum and the conscious mind. It throws a bridge between present-day consciousness, always in danger of losing its roots, and the natural, unconscious, instinctive wholeness of primitive ideas. Though this mediation, the uniqueness, peculiarity, and one-sidedness of our present individual consciousness are linked up. Through this mediation, the uniqueness, peculiarity, and one-sidedness of our present individual consciousness are linked up again with its natural racial roots. Progress and development are ideas not lightly to be rejected, but they lose all meaning if people only arrive at their new state as a fragment of oneself, having left one's essential hinterland behind one in a shadow of the unconscious, in a state of primitivity, or indeed barbarism. The conscious mind, split off from its origin, incapable of realizing the meaning of the new state, then relapses all too easily into a situation far worse from the one from which the innovation was intended to free it. Exemplia sunt odiosa. It was Friedrich Schiller who first had an inkling of this problem, but neither his contemporaries nor his successors were capable of drawing any conclusions. Instead, people incline more than ever to educate children and nothing more. I therefore suspect that the Furor Pedagogicus is a God-sent method of bypassing the central problem touched on by Schiller, namely the education of the educator. Children are educated by what the grown-ups is and not what he says. The popular faith in words is a veritable disease of the mind, for a superstition of this sort always leads further and further away from people's foundations and seduces people into a disastrous identification of the personality with whatever slogan may be in vogue. Meanwhile, everything that has been overcome and left behind by so-called progress sinks deeper and deeper into the unconscious, from which there re-emerges in the end the primitive condition of identity with the mass. Instead of the expected progress, this condition now becomes reality. As civilization develops, the bisexual primordial being turns into a symbol of the unity of personality, a symbol of the self, where the war of opposites finds peace. In this way, the primordial being becomes the distant goal of people's self-development, having been from the very beginning a projection of their unconscious wholeness. Wholeness consists in the union of the conscious and the unconscious personality. Just as every individual derives from masculine and feminine genes, and the sex is determined by the predominance of the corresponding genes, so in the psyche it is only the conscious mind in a person that has the masculine sign, while the unconscious mind by nature feminine. The reverse is true in the case of women. All I have done in my anima theory is to rediscover and reformulate this fact. It has long been known. The idea of the connucio of the male and female, which became almost a technical term in the Hermetic philosophy, appears in Gnosticism as the mysterium iniquitatis, probably not uninfluenced by the Old Testament divine marriage, as performed, for instance, by Hosea. Such things are hinted at not only by certain traditional customs, but by the quotation from the Gospel according to the Egyptians in the second epistle of Clement. Quote, "When the two shall be one, the outside is the inside, the male with the female, neither male nor female." Clement of Alexandria introduced this logion with the words, "When ye have trampled on the garments of shame with thy feet," which probably refers to the body for Clement as well as Cassian, from whom the quotation was taken over, and the pseudo-Clement, too, interpreted the words in a spiritual sense, in contrast with the Gnostics, who would seem to have taken the connucio all too literally. They took care, however, through the practice of abortion and other restrictions, that the biological meaning of their acts did not swamp the religious significance of the rite. While in church mysticism the primordial image of the hieros gamos was sublimated on a lofty plane, and only occasionally, for instance, with the Mechthild of Magdeburg, approached the physical sphere in emotional intensity. For the rest of the world, it remained very much alive and continued to be the object of a special psychic preoccupation. In this respect, the symbolical drawings of Opicenius de Canistris affords us an interesting glimpse of the way in which this primordial image was instrumental in uniting opposites, even in pathological state. On the other hand, in the Hermetic philosophy that throve in the Middle Ages, the Connucio was performed wholly in the physical realm in an admittedly abstract theory of the Coniugium solis et lunae, which, despite this drawback, gives the creative imagination much occasion for anthropomorphic flights. Such being the state of affairs, it is readily understandable that the primordial image of the hermaphrodite should reappear in modern psychology in the guise of the male-female antithesis. In other words, as male consciousness and personified female unconsciousness. But the psychological process of bringing things to consciousness has complicated the picture considerably. Whereas the old science was almost exclusively a field in which only the man's unconscious could project itself, the new psychology has to acknowledge the existence of an autonomous female psyche as well. Hence the case is reversed, and a feminine consciousness confronts a masculine personification of the unconscious, which can no longer be called anima, but animus. This discovery also complicates the problem of the connuncio. Originally, this archetype played its part entirely in the field of fertility magic, and thus remained for a very long time a purely biological phenomenon, with no other purpose than the fecundation. But even in early antiquity, the symbolical meaning of the act seems to have increased. Thus, for example, the physical performance of the hieros gamos as a sacred rite not only became a mystery, it faded into mere conjecture. As we have seen, Gnosticism, too, endeavored in all its seriousness to subordinate the physiological into the metaphysical. Finally, the Church severed the connuncio from the physical reality altogether, and natural philosophy turned it into an abstract theoria. These developments meant the gradual transformation of the archetype into a psychological process which, in theory, we can call a combination of consciousness and unconscious processes. In practice, however, it is not so simple, because as a rule, the feminine unconscious of a man is projected upon a feminine partner, and the masculine unconscious of a woman is projected upon a man. The elucidation of these problems is a special branch of psychology and has no part in a discussion of the mythological hermaphrodite. 4. The child as beginning and end. Faust, after his death, is received as a boy in the choir of blessed youths. I do not know whether Goethe was referring with this particular idea to the cupids on antique gravestones. It is not unthinkable. The figure of the cucullatus points to the hooded, and that is invisible one, the genius of the departed, who reappears in the childlike frolics of a new life, surrounded by the sea forms of dolphins and tritons. The sea is the favorite symbol for the unconscious, the mother of all that lives, just as the child is in certain circumstances, for example, in the case of Hermes and Dactyls, closely related to the phallus, symbol of the begetter. So it comes up again in the sepulchral phallus, symbol of a renewed begetting. The child is therefore renatus in novum infantiam. It is thus both beginning and end, an initial and a terminal creature. The initial creature existed before people were, and the terminal creature will be when people are no longer. Psychologically speaking, this means that the child symbolizes the pre-conscious and the post-conscious essence of people. The pre-conscious essence is the unconscious state of earliest childhood. The post-conscious conscious essence The post-conscious essence is the anticipation by analogy of life after death. In this idea, the all-embracing nature of psychic wholeness is expressed. Wholeness is never compromised within the compass of the conscious mind. It includes the indefinite and indefinable extent of the unconscious as well. Wholeness, empirically speaking, is therefore of immeasurable extent, older and younger than consciousness, and enfolding it in time and space. There is no speculation, but an immediate psychic experience. Not only is the conscious process continually accompanied, it is often guided, helped, or interpreted by unconscious happenings. The child has a psychic life before it has consciousness. Even the adult still says and does things whose significances one realizes only later, if ever, and yet one said them and did them as if one knew what they meant. Our dreams are continually saying things beyond our conscious comprehension, which is why they are so useful in the therapy of neuroses. We have intimations and intuitions from unknown sources. Fears, moods, plans, and hopes come to us with no invisible causation. These concrete experiences are at the bottom of our feelings, and we know ourselves very little, and at the bottom, too, of painful conjecture that we might have surprises in store for ourselves. Primitive people is no puzzle to themselves. The question, what is human, is the question that people have always kept until last. Primitive people have so much psyche outside their conscious mind that the experience of something psychic outside one is far more familiar to one than to us. Consciousness, hedged about by psychic powers, sustained or threatened or deluded by them, is the age-old experience of humans. This experience has projected itself into the archetype of the child, which expresses humans' wholeness. The child is all that is abandoned and exposed, and at the same time divinely powerful. The insignificant, dubious beginnings and the triumphant end. The eternal child in human is an indescribable experience, an incongruity, a handicap, a divine prerogative, an imponderable that determines the ultimate worth or worthlessness of a personality. 4. Conclusion. I am aware that a psychological commentary on the child archetype without detailed documentation must remain a mere sketch. But since this is virgin territory for the psychologist, my main endeavor has been to stake out the possible extent of the problems raised by our archetype, and to describe, at least consensually, its different aspects. Clear-cut distinction and strict formulations are quite impossible in this field, seeing that a kind of fluid interpenetration belongs to the very nature of our archetypes. They can only be roughly circumscribed at best. Their living meaning comes out more from their presentation as a whole than a single formulation. Every attempt to focus them more sharply is immediately punished by the intangible core of meaning, losing its luminosity. No archetype can be reduced to a simple formula. It is a vessel which we can never empty and never fill. It is a potential existence only, and when it takes shape in manner, it is no longer what it was. It persists throughout the ages and requires interpreting ever anew. The archetypes are the imperishable elements of the unconscious, and they change their shape continually. It was well nigh hopeless undertaking to tear a single archetype out of the living tissue of the psyche, and despite their interwovenness, they do form units of measure that can be apprehended intuitively. Psychology, as one of the many expressions of psychic life, operates with ideas which in their turn are derived from archetypal structures and thus generate a somewhat more abstract kind of myth. Psychology, therefore, translates the archaic speech of myth into the modern mythologium, not yet, of course, recognized as such, which constitutes one element of the myth's science. This seemingly hopeless undertaking is a living and lived myth, satisfying to persons of a corresponding temperament. indeed beneficial insofar as they have been cut off from their psychic origins by neurotic disassociation. As a matter of experience, we meet the child archetype in spontaneous and in therapeutically induced individuation processes. The first manifestation of the child is, as a rule, a totally unconscious phenomenon. Here the patient identifies herself with her personal infantilism. Then, under the influence of therapy, we get a more or less gradual separation from an objectification of the child. That is, the identity breaks down and is accompanied by an intensification, sometimes technically induced, of fantasy, and the result that archaic or mythological features become increasingly apparent. Further transformations run true to the hero myth. The theme of mighty feats is generally absent, but on the other hand, the mythical dangers play all the greater part. At this stage there is usually another identification, this time with the hero, whose role is attractive for a variety of reasons. The identification is often extremely stubborn and dangerous to the psychic equilibrium. If it can be broken down and if consciousness can be reduced to human properties, the figure of the hero can gradually be differentiated into a symbol of the self. In practical reality, however, it is of course not enough for the patient merely to know about such developments. What counts is her experience of the various transformations. The initial stage of personal infantilism presents the picture of an abandoned or misunderstood or unjustly treated child with overwhelming pretensions. The epiphany of the hero, the second identification, shows itself in a corresponding inflation. The colossal pretension grows into a conviction that one is something extraordinary, or else the impossibility of the pretension ever being fulfilled only proves one's inferiority, which is favorable to the role of the heroic sufferer, a negative inflation. In spite of their contradictoriness, both forms are identical, because conscious megalomania is balanced by unconscious compensatory inferiority, and conscious inferiority by unconscious megalomania. You never get one without the other. Once the reef of the second identification has been successfully circumnavigated, conscious process can be cleanly separated from the unconscious, and the latter observed objectively. This leads to the possibility of an accommodation from the unconscious, and thus to a possible synthesis of the conscious and unconscious elements of knowledge and action. This, in turn, leads to a shifting of the center of personality from the ego to the self. In this psychological framework, the motifs of abandonment, invincibility, hermaphroditism, and the beginning and end take their place as distinct categories of experience and understanding.